It looked like any other roadside diner. Greasy counter, flickering neon sign, waitress topping off coffee with a tired smile. But at booth 6, espionage was the main course. A Soviet spy sat with a menu in hand, waiting for a signal. The recruit was late. The sugar canister held more than sweetener, and by the time the jukebox hit its third track, classified U.S. military secrets were already in motion. This wasn't fiction. This was real. And it started with a slice of pie. During the height of the Cold War, the KGB didn't just operate in the shadows of embassies or the back alleys of Berlin. They set up shop right off the interstate. In America's diners, those 24-hour pit stops where nobody asked questions and everybody minded their own business, Soviet intelligence found a goldmine of opportunity. They weren't chasing high-ranking officials. They were targeting the overlooked. Night shift workers, disillusioned defense contractors, lonely veterans with stories to tell and security clearances to match. What followed was a recruitment strategy so unorthodox, so low-tech, it slipped right under the FBI's nose until it didn't. He always ordered the same thing, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and a black coffee. And he always sat at the far end of the counter, 2 stools from the pie display case, where the light from the jukebox didn't quite reach. His name was Ron Halpern, but no one at the diner called him that. Around the staff, he was just the Lockheed guy, a reference to the defense contractor logo on his windbreaker, and the quiet routine that followed him like clockwork. Each Tuesday and Thursday, sometime after 11 p.m., he'd show up with calloused hands, oil-stained fingernails, and a pocket notebook he never opened, but always kept close. His shoulders were heavy, his eyes distant, and the creases on his face told stories of nights spent hunched over technical schematics, days lost to the thrum of classified projects, and a marriage slowly disintegrating under the pressure of his own silence. To the KGB, men like Ron were more valuable than colonels or congressmen. They were invisible, exhausted, and dangerously ignored. Their access was real, even if indirect, and their resentment brewed in coffee-stained mugs and long-forgotten service medals. The Soviet playbook didn't call for operatives to charm senators or bribe Pentagon chiefs. It called for observation, patience, and an understanding of human weakness. Diners like this one, off Route 60, in a deadbeat patch of Ohio, halfway between Youngstown and nowhere, were fertile ground. They were frequented by the types who worked in secure labs, but spent their nights drinking away frustrations, by radar engineers who couldn't afford rent after a divorce, by Vietnam vets retrained to run wiring through missile chassis and paid just enough to survive. Every stool was a potential asset, every complaint a signal, every unpaid tab a leverage point. Soviet spotters worked under deep cover, posing as traveling salesmen, drifters, or retired electricians, men who could strike up a conversation without suspicion. They'd start with something innocuous, the price of gas, the layoffs at Plant 14, the broken vending machine in the employee break room. If the target responded with a story, they listened. If the story carried bitterness, they leaned in. The ideal candidate wasn't loyal to the USSR. They didn't need to be. They only had to be tired, broke, or drunk enough to think no one was watching. By the 3rd or 4th interaction, the questions would come. What's your line of work again? Still got that clearance? They ever tell you what's inside those black boxes? And if the man answered with a shrug or a knowing grin, the recruitment dance had begun. What made this method brilliant wasn't its sophistication, it was its ordinariness. There were no briefcases, no ciphers, no code names yet. Just 2 strangers talking at a Formica counter, sharing war stories, financial regrets, and the quiet understanding that the system hadn't paid them back. In the eyes of Moscow, America's forgotten workers weren't just collateral damage, they were gold mines. The trick was finding the ones who still had something to lose and offering them a way out before anyone noticed they were slipping. He went by Greg from Pittsburgh, though he had never been to Pennsylvania, and his real name hadn't been spoken aloud since he left Leningrad in 1974, under a forged Canadian passport and a trail of erased identities. To the waitresses, Greg was just another lonely white guy in a wrinkled sport coat who paid in cash, tipped in exact change, and always asked if the cherry pie was fresh that day, even though he never ordered it. His cover was airtight, an independent insurance adjuster for trucking companies, a job vague enough to explain his frequent travel and boring enough that no one asked questions. He carried a briefcase full of fake claims, a business card printed in bulk from a self-serve kiosk in Harrisburg, and a collection of regional dialects he'd practiced in front of motel mirrors for years. Soft Midwestern vowels when in Ohio, a nasal twang in the Carolinas, clipped consonants in New Jersey. But his real job didn't involve paperwork or policies. Greg was a spotter, a low-key human radar system trained to detect the flicker of potential in the worn-out, the overlooked, and the underpaid. His training at Yasinovo had emphasized one skill above all else: patience. He'd sit at the counter of roadside diners for hours, sipping scorched coffee, pretending to read the local paper, his ears tuned to every conversation around him. He listened for key phrases: shut down, pay freeze, layoff list, and watched for the glint of a security badge accidentally left visible, or the weary way someone rubbed their temple while talking about base protocols or defense audits. When a man ordered 4 whiskeys in 30 minutes and started mumbling about satellite schematics and idiot supervisors, Greg didn't pounce. He logged it, marked the face, and returned the next week. The KGB had no interest in coercing anyone. Their model was slower, quieter, and ultimately more sustainable. Identify a man with access, confirm his dissatisfaction, and become the person who listened when no one else did. Greg's approach was never direct. First, he'd ask to borrow a cigarette or make a comment about the game on the TV overhead. If the man replied, Greg would nod, toss in a joke, maybe ask where he worked. He never said the word clearance. But if the guy said he worked over at McDonald or Northrop, Greg knew the window had opened. He'd offer to buy a drink, claim he used to work in logistics out in Allentown, drop a few choice frustrations about corporate greed or Washington waste to see if the man bit. If he did, Greg would listen, deeply, intently, nodding in all the right places, laughing when prompted, grunting in sympathy when the subject of layoffs came up. He wasn't recruiting, not yet. His job was to observe, to listen, to report. The actual pitch would come later, from someone with a different name and a different story, but it was Greg from Pittsburgh who cracked the door open, who saw what others missed, who found America's lonely, bitter secrets hiding in plain sight between burnt toast and bad coffee. The first time Ron Halpern opened up, it wasn't because someone asked him a question, it was because someone didn't. It was a Thursday night just after midnight, the kind of dead silent lull between the dinner crowd and the drunks, and Greg from Pittsburgh was perched on the stool beside him at Benny's diner, nursing a coffee that hadn't been hot in an hour, and watching Ron methodically tear the corner off a napkin, bit by bit. They'd seen each other before, half nods, occasional small talk about the jukebox always skipping track 4. But this time, Ron just muttered, "You ever wonder how many years of your life you've wasted doing something that doesn't mean a damn thing?" Greg didn't blink. He just gave a low chuckle and said, "Buddy, that's what insurance adjusting is." Ron gave a dry laugh, then another, and it cracked something. Over the next half hour, between forkfuls of cold mashed potatoes and careful quiet prompting from Greg, Ron spilled a year's worth of frustration. The layoff rumors, the second mortgage, his daughter's braces he couldn't afford, and the way his wife looked at him now like she regretted the last 14 years. He didn't say what he worked on directly, but Greg knew how to listen between the lines. References to SAT recon layouts, payload recalibrations, and the phrase "we're not supposed to talk about the fuel" were all red flags turned green lights in his mental file. Greg didn't push. He played the role of the everyman, another blue-collar guy who'd been chewed up by the system, whose wife left him in 1980 and took the dog, who'd been on the road ever since, adjusting claims and dodging alimony. They bonded over bitterness, not ideology. Greg bought his next slice of pie, not as a bribe, but as a gesture. "You look like you could use a break," he said simply, and Ron just nodded, eyes distant. A week later, Greg wasn't there, but someone else was, a man with thinning blonde hair, wire-framed glasses, and the unthreatening air of a regional sales rep for some unknown company. He slid into the booth across from Ron like they were old friends, introduced himself as Tom, and said Greg had told him Ron might be a guy worth knowing. Tom didn't talk politics either. He talked work, opportunities, contract gigs off the books, a way to use Ron's skills, engineering insight, he called it, for something that paid more than food stamps and regret. No pressure, just a way to earn, to matter, to stop being invisible. Ron hesitated, But Tom was calm, unassuming, and relentless in a soft-spoken, you-can-walk-away-anytime kind of way. It wasn't framed as espionage, it was framed as dignity. A man-to-man offer in a place where dignity went to die. By the time the check came, Tom had slipped Ron a card with a number, no name, just the digits, and told him to call if he wanted out of the hole he was in. The pitch was never dramatic. It was humane. That was the art, not recruitment, rescue. After Ron made the call, a shaky, static-laced conversation from a payphone behind a liquor store on 3rd Street, things changed in ways so subtle he almost convinced himself they weren't real. He didn't meet Tom again, not formally, but he began to notice a rhythm, a pattern to the late-night crowd at Benny's diner. Certain men showed up like clockwork, always alone, always ordering the same thing. One guy came in every Wednesday and ordered 2 slices of blueberry, coffee black, no cream, no sugar, even though he barely touched the pie. Another sat in the corner booth with a crossword he never finished, always using a red pen. A different man would ask if the jukebox still played Sinatra's Summer Wind, even though no such record existed in Benny's rotation. At first, Ron thought it was paranoia, but then he got his first assignment, a folded napkin under his plate, barely visible unless you knew to look. Written in pencil, disguised as idle scribbles, were part numbers and a date, schematics for a cooling unit on a recon satellite, and a delivery time for the next shift. He understood immediately what was being asked. He remembered the drafts back at the lab, the versions marked for decommission, the fact that nobody really cared about inventory on old tech. He brought the microfilm 2 nights later, tucked into the hollowed-out base of a sugar canister marked with a faint scratch on the bottom. The man at the counter, Greg, or whoever he really was, took his coffee, reached for the sugar, unscrewed the top, and within a few fluid movements swapped it for another. No words were exchanged. The waitress poured another round. Everything continued as if nothing had happened. That was the genius of it. Diners were too ordinary to notice, too noisy, too greasy, too anonymous. Under fluorescent lights and the hiss of a griddle, secrets changed hands between ketchup bottles and plastic napkin holders. Coded pie orders became the language of espionage. Blueberry meant drop complete, cherry meant drop compromised, pecan meant abort entirely. The language changed weekly, transmitted through trivial notes left on receipts or in crossword puzzles handed off with fake irritation. Sometimes, the menus themselves were swapped out. One laminated copy had a tiny red dot printed on the bottom corner of the page 3. That dot meant, "You're being watched." Ron learned to read these signs like scripture. When a man ordered apple pie with lemon tea and folded his napkin 3 times before leaving, Ron knew it was time to dispose of his burner phone and avoid the diner for 72 hours. Some nights, the jukebox itself played a role. Retrofitted by Soviet techs posing as appliance repairmen, it picked up ambient chatter and relayed shortwave snippets to a van parked 4 blocks away. The very booth Ron used had a tiny hole drilled under the table, the microphone no bigger than a dime, wired into the wall behind. A framed picture of the 1962 local softball champs. What looked like nostalgia was surveillance. What looked like routine was war. His name was Henry Waltz, age 43, divorced, no children, and by 1983, he'd been working maintenance at the Prairie Lake Nuclear Facility outside Wausau, Wisconsin for nearly 9 years without a single promotion. He was the kind of man who blended into employee directories and shift rosters so seamlessly that most of his colleagues couldn't remember if he worked days or nights. But Henry remembered everything, every slight, every passed-over review, every time a younger, smoother-talking engineer got bumped ahead of him in line. He was smart enough to understand the guts of the plant's cooling systems, smart enough to bypass the internal lockouts on digital schematics when the system crashed, and that intelligence, combined with decades of quiet resentment, made him exactly the kind of man the Soviets had been trained to find. The approach began at Darla's Diner on Highway 52, a roadside stop just far enough from the plant to feel unrelated. Henry came in. Every Wednesday after swing shift, always ordered the chili and rye toast, and usually sat alone. That's where Victor, a KGB spotter posing as a Canadian electrician working contract jobs in the Midwest, started showing up. They talked hockey at first, then weather, then layoffs. After 3 weeks, Henry was venting about the new supervisor from Detroit, who didn't know a coolant loop from a carburetor. Victor just listened, nodded, bought him pie. It wasn't long before Henry mentioned he still had clearance on the facility's old internal server. Outdated junk, sure, he said, but junk the new guys don't even bother checking. That's when Victor leaned in, asked if Henry thought what the U.S. was doing with nuclear waste storage was ethical. Talked about politics, not party lines, but the moral failure of American leadership. The hollowed-out unions, the abandoned working man. It wasn't ideology, it was a mirror. Henry saw himself in that reflection. The first exchange was small, a scanned printout of non-sensitive maintenance logs on a thumb drive tucked inside a cigarette pack. Payment came in the form of a travel stipend, $200 in an envelope with a note that read, "Thanks again for the consultation." The next exchange came 2 weeks later with schematics of a decommissioned valve system Henry insisted no one would miss. Victor gave him a new drop method, gum wrappers. Wrigley's spearmint, folded twice and inserted with a piece of microfilm, then resealed using a cheap heat clamp Henry borrowed from the plant's vending technician kit. Payment moved to Soviet rubles, not for use, but for leverage. Henry liked the feel of it, the idea that somewhere in Moscow, someone valued what he knew. But secrets, no matter how small, don't stay secrets for long, not in a plant full of fuel-bitter men. When Henry bragged, half drunk, at the Copper Tap bar about getting consulting cash from a mysterious Canadian friend, a younger coworker named Danny Meyer, recently passed over for a shift bonus, got suspicious. Within 2 weeks, Danny filed an anonymous tip with the FBI. By the time agents picked up Henry in late '84, he'd passed 7 full rolls of schematic microfilm. His final drop? Left in a sugar packet canister at Darla's, wrapped in a gum wrapper, placed next to a slice of rhubarb pie. By 1976, something peculiar began surfacing in the FBI's breach analytics. Cases that, on paper, had no reason to be connected were all exhibiting the same strange proximity: classified material leaks, low-clearance intel appearing in foreign intercepts, minor but consistent losses in compartmentalized technical programs, all traced back not to embassies or defense headquarters, but to small towns with no apparent strategic significance, except for one overlooked commonality. Each breach clustered within a few miles of a 24-hour diner. At first, the correlation was dismissed as coincidence or the natural side effect of contractor distribution across rural America, but one agent in the Milwaukee field office, Special Agent Meredith Blaine, dug deeper. She pulled logs from over 30 investigations, cross-referenced times, locations, even personal habits of suspects, and a pattern emerged: late-night diners off interstates or near defense-adjacent towns, frequented by the same kinds of people: disgruntled engineers, janitorial staff at defense labs, civilian subcontractors. It wasn't just happening once, it was happening everywhere. The moment Blaine's memo reached Quantico, the Bureau authorized a quiet internal directive, Operation Watchcap. The goal was simple: verify the connection, then identify the hand guiding it. Agents were embedded as dishwashers, fry cooks, truckers, and even busboys. They showed up in Idaho, Kentucky, Wisconsin, and Oregon, anywhere a contractor lived within driving distance of a late-night greasy spoon. Listening devices were slipped into jukeboxes, menus were printed with faint registration marks to identify counterfeits, and female agents were trained to blend in as waitresses, charming regulars while memorizing badge numbers left dangling from jackets and snippets of half-drunk shop talk. The old-school approach of Hoover's Bureau was now married to a Cold War reality. The battleground had shifted from embassies and docks to truck stops and diners. Surveillance vans parked across the street disguised as septic services and delivery trucks. Orders like pecan pie with double whipped cream were suddenly being logged, translated, and cross-checked for code word patterns. Agents were instructed to observe only, no interference, no arrests, until a chain of custody could be built. Blaine herself posed as a line cook in Missouri for 6 weeks, flipping eggs while recording every face that passed through the doors of a diner 3.2 miles from an air defense calibration lab. Her notes detailed a man who always arrived at 2 a.m. after a Tuesday graveyard shift, always paid in exact change, always asked for a window seat, and always read a newspaper from 10 days earlier. These weren't anomalies anymore. They were signatures. Someone was orchestrating these meetings, vetting locations, and using America's most anonymous venues as covert bridges between information and foreign handlers. What disturbed the Bureau most wasn't just that the leaks were happening, it was that they were being conducted in plain sight, using places so familiar, so deeply woven into American culture, that no one ever thought to look twice. The realization struck like a cold wind. The enemy wasn't outside the gates. They were at the counter, sipping coffee, listening, and blending in so well that even the most paranoid agents had overlooked the salt shaker full of secrets sitting right next to the napkin dispenser. Operation Nightcap officially began on February 2nd, 1981, under the gray veil of a Midwest winter and the kind of bureaucratic paranoia that had been simmering for nearly a decade, finally boiling over after too many quiet leaks and not enough convictions. It was designed not as a singular strike, but a dragnet. 12 weeks, 15 states, 67 federal agents rotating through dozens of roadside diners, each selected based on proximity to defense contractors, energy labs, and communications hubs. Surveillance vans were fitted with heat sensors and directional mics, menus were dusted for prints, receipts were cataloged, and waitresses were quietly deputized under gag orders that never expired. The FBI operated with surgical precision. Agents embedded as cooks, janitors, and late-shift regulars, cataloging pie orders and following men who looked too nervous, ordering coffee, or stayed too long after their food got cold. The operation's defining moment, however, came in the unlikeliest of places. A weathered diner called Ruthie's Table off Route 283, just outside Dodge City, Kansas. Ruthie's had a peeling Coca-Cola sign out front, a broken neon open light, and a chalkboard that advertised lemon meringue pie, even when they were out of lemons. But on March 18th, it became the stage for one of the Cold War's most bizarre espionage takedowns. The suspect was a Soviet handler operating under the alias Brother Elijah, a soft-spoken man with salt and pepper hair, bifocals, and a traveling preacher shtick that disarmed even the most skeptical locals. He handed out pocket Bibles, quoted scripture in a syrupy drawl, and preached humility while orchestrating dead drops behind sugar bins and coded exchanges inside hymnals. His mark was Carl Brenner, a mid-level systems engineer contracting for a defense contractor out of Wichita, with access to prototype schematics for long-range communications gear. Carl was angry at his ex-wife, at the IRS, at the men in suits who got bonuses while he couldn't make rent. And Brother Elijah played him like a hymn. The drop was arranged during a staged prayer session in Booth 7. Carl arrived first, looking uneasy, ordered coffee and cornbread. Elijah arrived 6 minutes later with a Bible in one hand and a cigarette pack in the other. Undercover agents, posing as truckers, had already been in place for 2 days and were recording the exchange from behind a modified vending machine. The entire handoff took 11 seconds. Carl slid the pack across the table as Elijah bowed his head in prayer, murmuring, "The Lord protects those who deliver truth," a line later dissected for its sheer theatricality in bureau training manuals. As Carl stood to leave, 2 agents intercepted him in the parking lot, while 2 more entered from the kitchen. Elijah didn't resist. He simply placed the Bible on the table and raised his hands, whispering, "And so it ends." Inside the cigarette pack, folded blueprints, 2 microfilm canisters, and a list of part serials. The bust blew the lid off similar operations in Oklahoma, Texas, and Colorado, validating every suspicion Operation Nightcap had built itself on. The message to Moscow was clear. The coffee was still hot, but the sugar was under watch. By the time Operation Nightcap wrapped in April of 1981, not all roads led to handcuffs. Some led back into the shadows, deeper than before, with new handlers, new loyalties, and the crushing weight of moral compromise. Among the dozens of suspects identified, 5 were quietly turned, flipped by late-night interrogations in motel rooms, promises of reduced sentences, or just the unbearable weight of their own guilt. These were not master spies or hardened ideologues. They were maintenance workers, radar techs, clerical assistants who'd been groomed with sympathy and flattery, told they were helping balance a rigged system, only to wake up inside a federal sting operation where every pie order and napkin fold had been recorded. One of the earliest to turn was Linda Kepler, a secretary at a classified logistics node in Utah, who had been passing harmless inventory details to a man she thought was an academic researcher from Helsinki. When the FBI confronted her with audio, tapes, and photographs, she broke down within hours, Sturmande von skiers agreeing to cooperate in exchange for immunity, she continued working her job, wearing a wire, feeding disinformation back to her Soviet contact for over a year until her handler disappeared without a trace, presumed exfiltrated or quietly executed by his own side once the leak became obvious. Another case was James Jimmy Ranford, an Air Force mechanic in Louisiana who had handed over spare parts lists and flight schedules in exchange for monthly envelopes of cash hidden inside a Bible stored in his mother's attic. Caught mid-drop, Jimmy chose survival over loyalty and began running double-blind operations, carefully feeding the Soviets manipulated data designed to mislead rather than inform. He did this for 2.5 years until the Russians stopped showing up, the signals went dead, and his life returned to the eerie silence of uncertainty. But not everyone flipped. 2 known operatives simply vanished. One was Alex, a supposed Czech-American trade consultant who had embedded himself in California's defense subcontractor world. After being tailed for 3 months and identified in 4 separate drops, he disappeared the night before his scheduled arrest. No flights, no bus tickets, no border crossings, no corpse, just gone, like he'd stepped off the edge of the continent. The other was Roger Bales, a disillusioned nuclear physicist with a gambling problem, last seen in New Mexico. He missed a drop, then another, then was found dead in a motel bathtub with an empty pill bottle and a suicide note so vague that half the bureau believed it was staged. These cases didn't just raise questions of legality, they tore at the moral fabric of what it meant to betray your country, or to believe you already had been betrayed. Were they as traitors selling secrets for cash, or victims chewed up by a government that never saw them until it was too late? Were they patriots who redeemed themselves in silence, or pawns in a game neither side had the decency to call what it was? Desperation, dressed up in flags? The truth was more complicated than any file would admit, and buried deeper than any microfilm drop ever went. Long after the Berlin Wall crumbled, and the last Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin, the battlefields of the Cold War remained scattered across America, not in missile silos or Pentagon archives, but in the tiled floors and faded vinyl booths of roadside diners from New Jersey to New Mexico, where for over 2 decades, whispered loyalties and folded napkins carried the weight of national security. The war wasn't always waged with rifles or rhetoric. It lived in the quiet, in the clink of coffee mugs and the static hum of a jukebox, in the tired gaze of a night shift engineer counting pennies for a slice of pie, while debating whether the price of silence outweighed the cost of betrayal. Ruthie's table outside Dodge City now serves Tex-Mex under new management, unaware that in 1981, its corner booth hosted a Soviet handler posing as a preacher, or that its jukebox once housed a listening device that recorded 3 months of operational data. Benny's Diner in Ohio still opens at 6 a.m. sharp and boasts the best meatloaf on Route 60. But the locals don't know that for years, a Soviet spotter known only as Greg from Pittsburgh sat by the window every Tuesday, scouting for men with Department of Defense lanyards and tired eyes. Darla's Diner in Wisconsin has a new sign, a new paint job, but if you pull back the laminated menu at table 4, the faint scratch used to signal a confirmed drop is still there, aged and meaningless now, but once part of a system so intricate it fooled nearly everyone who passed through. These places, these seemingly insignificant American diners, became the Cold War's unlikeliest stage, neutral territory where uniforms didn't matter, where ideology wore denim and defeat smelled like burnt coffee. For Soviet handlers, they were the perfect blend of anonymity and routine. For FBI agents, they were minefields. One booth might hold a man passing schematics to the enemy, while the next held a trucker arguing over toast. They were too public for raids, too common for suspicion, and perhaps most hauntingly, too familiar to protect against. The war, in these places, was fought in gestures. A pie order meant drop complete, a folded napkin meant abort, and a request for extra sugar might have been the cue for surveillance teams to roll tape. The waitresses never knew, though some suspected later, in interviews with declassified files in their hands, and memories they didn't understand at the time. "I always wondered why that guy ordered coffee, but never drank it," one said. Another remembered a man who tipped in rubles once, thinking it was foreign art. Today, tourists pass through these diners with no clue they're walking through war history. They snap photos of retro booths, post reviews about the pancakes, maybe even sit where a double agent once did. But the legacy remains, not in the headlines or textbooks, but in the quiet echo of footsteps on linoleum floors where the Cold War didn't end in gunfire, but in whispers between strangers over a cup of black coffee and a slice of warm, weaponized pie. The stool by the window is still there, third from the end, cushion torn at the seam, rocking slightly if you lean too far back. A waitress named Diane pours the first cup of coffee into a chipped ceramic mug and places it on the counter like a ritual offering to no one in particular, unaware that 40 years ago, that same stool was warmed by a man who never gave his real name and never stayed long enough to finish his drink. The steam rising now from that cup swirls the same way it did then, a small, invisible signal that something had just happened, or was about to. And yet nothing in the diner gives away its history. The jukebox in the corner still plays faded Patsy Cline ballads, its speakers slightly blown, but no one remembers that for 3 years it held a wire the size of a thread that once relayed entire conversations back to a bureau van disguised as a plumbing truck across the street. The napkin dispensers have been replaced, the menu's updated, but if you knew where to look, beneath the edge of the pie display, under the linoleum lip of the counter, you might still find the faint etching of a code, a dead letter from an invisible war. The Cold War didn't always speak in the language of power or politics. It whispered through late-night monologues about mortgage payments, through trembling hands passing matchbooks with numbers written inside, through glances held a moment too long across a crowded room where everyone pretended not to see. It lived not just in Washington briefings or Moscow dead drops, but in the in-between, in diners that stayed open all night, in stools that turned into confessionals, in the subtle choreography of everyday Americans who never knew their grief, their desperation, or their silence had become currency for a game they never asked to play. Somewhere in the back, a man once left a microfilm strip inside a packet of Sweet and Low. Another, flushed with guilt, tore a schematic in half and flushed it down the restroom toilet, only to find the toilet jammed and a line forming behind him. A waitress once noticed 2 men leave without eating, their food untouched, and joked to her coworker, "Guess the coffee wasn't strong enough for Spies." She laughed, not knowing she was right. And now, the coffee's still bad, the lighting's still too bright, and the corner booth still creaks when someone leans into a whisper. But the war is over, or maybe just different. The final transaction happened long ago, but its heat lingers in the cushion of that stool, the echo in that jukebox speaker, the weightless hush between 2 strangers at 2:47 a.m. when a check is paid, a nod is exchanged, and the waitress offers one last refill, never knowing what's already changed hands, what's already been lost, or what quiet little act of espionage she's just witnessed beneath the flickering glow of an open sign that never turns off. If this story kept you leaning in until the last drop, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true tales from the hidden corners of the Cold War. What looked like just another diner might have been a battlefield, and we've got plenty more stories where this came from.